Cleopatra VII. The Ptolemaic dynasty didn't just tolerate incest, they built a brand around it. For nearly 3 centuries, Egypt's Greek-speaking pharaohs treated sibling marriage not as a scandal, but as a divine mandate, pointing to Zeus and Hera as their celestial role models, and apparently deciding that if it worked for the gods, it would work for them. Cleopatra VII, born around 69 BC, was the product of this system, a family tree that had been folding back on itself since Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II, around 279 BC, establishing the precedent that would define the dynasty. Ptolemy II even took the epithet Philadelphus, meaning sibling-loving, as though he wanted to make absolutely sure posterity understood his priorities. By the time Cleopatra arrived, the bloodline had been looping through cousin marriages and close relative unions for so many generations that untangling her precise ancestry is nearly impossible. Her mother's identity remains historically uncertain, which is a remarkable thing to say about the most famous queen in history. And yet, Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke approximately 9 languages, according to the ancient historian Plutarch, was a gifted political strategist, and managed to align herself with the 2 most powerful men in the Roman world in sequence. She is the most functional person to ever emerge from a dynasty running on genetic fumes, which either says something extraordinary about her or something deeply unsettling about how much raw talent gets suppressed when your family has been marrying itself for 10 generations. She was the last of her line, and when she died in 30 BC, she took the Ptolemaic experiment in deliberate consanguinity with her, though the damage to the concept of healthy royal bloodlines had only just begun. Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's tomb contained 130 walking sticks, and for a long time people assumed they were ceremonial. They were not. The boy who ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BC needed them because his body, the product of a full sibling union between his father Akhenaten and a woman DNA analysis identified as Akhenaten's own sister, was failing him from the moment he was born. The 2010 JAMA study that analyzed genetic material from 11 royal mummies confirmed what the physical evidence had been suggesting all along. Tutankhamun had a calculated inbreeding coefficient of approximately 0.25, which is the statistical equivalent of being the child of 2 full biological siblings. The physical consequences were extensive and documented. He had a cleft palate, a club foot, Kohler disease causing bone necrosis in his foot, and multiple additional skeletal abnormalities identified through CT scanning. He likely walked with a pronounced limp, leaning on those canes not as symbols of authority but as tools of basic mobility. He died at approximately 19 years old, probably from a combination of malaria, multiple strains of which were found in his mummified remains, and the cascading organ failures that come with a body built on a compromised genetic blueprint. Found in his tomb alongside him were 2 tiny mummified figures, his daughters, both stillborn or dead in infancy, their own bodies too fragile to sustain life. He is the most scientifically documented case of royal inbreeding in human history, not because his situation was unique, but because modern technology finally gave us the tools to look directly at what the ancient Egyptians had done and measure exactly how much it cost. Joanna of Castile. History called her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, and then locked her in a castle for 46 years to make sure the story stuck. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who were themselves distant cousins, and was then married to Philip I of Habsburg, who was her second cousin, meaning the genetic compression that would eventually produce Charles II was already underway before Joanna was old enough to understand what a dynasty was. Whether Joanna was genuinely mentally ill or a politically dangerous queen who was systematically portrayed as unstable by the men who wanted her power is one of history's more pointed open questions. What is documented is that after Philip's sudden death in 1506, her grief was extreme and public. She reportedly refused to leave his coffin, ordering it opened to verify he was still dead, which her contemporaries treated as evidence of madness rather than the behavior of a woman who had been told repeatedly that her judgment could not be trusted. Her father Ferdinand had her imprisoned. Her son Charles V kept her imprisoned. She remained confined in Tordesillas from roughly 1509 until her death in 1555, meaning she outlived her jailers and her usefulness as a political problem by decades, dying at 75 inches, a room she had occupied for nearly half a century. Her son, Charles V, would become the most powerful ruler in Europe. Her grandson, Philip II, would inherit a Spanish empire at its height, and the inbreeding coefficient that would eventually produce a king who couldn't chew his own food was ticking forward with every generation. Each marriage a little closer, each family tree a little more tangled, and nobody in the room willing to say it out loud. Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1520 to 1566, at the absolute peak of its power. His armies reached the gates of Vienna, his navy controlled the Mediterranean, and his legal reforms earned him the title the lawgiver in his own lands. He is not on this list because he was inbred. He is on this list because he was the last person standing before the Ottoman system of succession began delivering visibly broken results, and understanding why requires understanding the machinery that produced his heirs. The Ottomans had formalized fratricide as succession policy. When a new sultan took the throne, his brothers were executed, a practice codified under Mehmed II in the late 15th century. When fratricide became politically uncomfortable in the early 17th century, it was replaced with the caste system, in which princes were confined in isolated palace apartments from childhood, with no education, no governance experience, and no meaningful human contact beyond a handful of companions. The genetic pool feeding this system was also narrowing. Royal women and concubines were drawn from an increasingly restricted network, and the top of the Ottoman bloodline had been compressing for generations. The results would arrive within 2 reigns. Suleiman's son, Selim II, was known as Selim the Drunk. His great-great-grandson Mustafa, I would be so mentally incapacitated that he spent his sultanate wandering palace halls and throwing coins into the sea. Suleiman himself was the last point at which Ottoman dynastic genetics and Ottoman imperial power were both simultaneously at their height. After him, one of those lines went only downward. Henry VI of England. Henry VI of England inherited a kingdom and a catastrophe in the same bloodstream. His maternal grandfather was Charles VI of France, a king who believed, with complete sincerity, that he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him, a delusion so specific and so persistent that it has its own entry in the history of psychiatric literature. Charles VI's episodes began in 1392 and continued until his death in 1422, and the cognitive fragility that produced them did not stop at the border. Henry VI, born in 1421, began showing signs of severe mental breakdown by his early 30s, and in August of 1453, he entered a complete catatonic collapse that lasted approximately 16 months. During this time, he could not speak, could not move with purpose, and could not recognize his own newborn son, Edward of Westminster, who was born during the breakdown and presented to his father repeatedly without any response. The political vacuum this created was the direct ignition point of the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that would consume England until 1485 and kill thousands. When Henry briefly recovered in late 1454, the damage was already irreversible. Rival factions had organized around his incapacity, and no amount of lucid intervals would put that back together. He was deposed in 1461, briefly restored in 1470, and almost certainly murdered in the Tower of London on or around the 21st of May, 1471. He is not a cautionary tale about weakness. He is a demonstration of what happens when a heritable psychiatric condition reaches the top of a monarchy during a moment of political instability, and the answer, consistently, is war. Mustafa, the first of the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa I survived the Ottoman succession process because he was considered too mentally impaired to be a threat, which is both the saddest and most clarifying sentence in this entire video. He was kept in the kafes, the palace confinement system for Ottoman princes, from a young age, in isolation that would have been psychologically devastating to anyone, let alone someone whose mental health was already compromised before the confinement began. When his nephew Ahmed I died in 1617, Mustafa emerged from the kafes and onto the throne. And what the court got was a sultan who reportedly wandered the palace, releasing palace staff from their duties for no reason, threw coins into the sea from palace windows, and was observed in states of apparent confusion and distress by court observers whose accounts survive in Ottoman chronicles. He was deposed after approximately 3 months. His nephew, Osman II, took the throne, then was assassinated in 1622 during a Janissary revolt, and Mustafa was reinstated not because anyone thought he was capable of ruling, but because the alternatives were worse. He lasted another year before being deposed again. He died in 1639, having technically been sultan twice, without having governed anything in any meaningful sense, the product of a dynastic system that had spent a century and a half eliminating its most capable potential heirs through fratricide and confinement while simultaneously narrowing its genetic pool. He was not a failure. He was an outcome. The system that produced him had been running the calculation for generations, and Mustafa I was simply what the math produced when it finally came due. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, which is higher than the expected coefficient of a child born to two full biological siblings, and that number alone should communicate everything about what the Habsburg dynasty had done to itself over 2 centuries of strategic, consanguineous marriage. A 2009 study published in PLOS One, authored by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero, calculated this figure and identified the most likely medical consequences: combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, both recessive conditions that only express themselves when defective copies are inherited from both parents simultaneously, which becomes nearly statistically inevitable when both parents are, genetically speaking, nearly the same person. His jaw protruded so severely from the characteristic Habsburg mandibular prognathism that he could not properly chew his food. His tongue was reportedly large enough to impede his speech. He could not walk until he was 8 years old. He was incontinent, prone to seizures, described by contemporaries as mentally limited, and in his final years became so consumed by superstition and religious ritual that an exorcism was reportedly performed at his request, because he had become convinced he was cursed. He was, in a way, just not supernaturally. He was married twice, to Marie-Louise of Orléans and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg, and produced no surviving children from either marriage. When he died on the 1st of November 1700, at age 38, his autopsy reportedly described a body in a state of extraordinary deterioration. Accounts mention shrunken organs, a single, undescended testicle, and systemic fluid accumulation, though the precise reliability of those accounts varies. His death without an heir triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped the borders and balance of power across Europe. He didn't bring down the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburg dynasty built him, one carefully arranged marriage at a time, and then watched him collapse under the weight of what they'd constructed. The 18th dynasty inbreeding cluster. Tutankhamun didn't arrive in a vacuum. He was the endpoint of at least 3 to 4 consecutive generations of deliberate, close relative marriage within ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, a sustained compression of bloodlines that makes him not an aberration, but a logical conclusion. His grandfather, Amenhotep III, who ruled from approximately 1388 to 1351 BC, is recorded in temple inscriptions as having married his own daughter, Sidamun, elevating her to the title of Great Royal Wife, a role that carried both ceremonial and dynastic significance. Whether this was consummated in the biological sense or was primarily a ritual consolidation of royal power remains debated among Egyptologists, but the inscriptional evidence of the marriage itself is not disputed. Amenhotep III's son, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, then continued the pattern, producing Tutankhamun with his own sister, according to the 2010 JAMA DNA study. The dynasty that followed from Amenhotep III, through Akhenaten, through Tutankhamun, represents one of the most sustained and archaeologically documented experiments in deliberate royal inbreeding in any ancient civilization, carried out not accidentally, but as a feature of how divine kingship was understood to function. The result was a boy king with a clubfoot and a handful of malarial infections who died at 19, leaving 2 stillborn daughters in his tomb and no living male heir behind him. Power passed eventually to the military general Horemheb, who was not of royal blood, and the 18th dynasty effectively ended there not with a conquest or a revolution, but with a bloodline that had compressed itself into silence. Ferdinand I of Austria. Ferdinand I became Emperor of Austria in 1835 and almost immediately demonstrated that the Habsburg dynasty had learned nothing from the previous 2 centuries of producing compromised heirs. His parents were first cousins twice over, meaning both sets of grandparents were also first cousins, making him the product of a double first cousin marriage, a level of genetic overlap that would be considered extraordinary outside the specific context of 19th century European royalty, where it was apparently considered a reasonable dynastic strategy. Ferdinand was epileptic, that much is historically documented, and his cognitive limitations were severe enough that Prince Metternich, one of the most strategically sophisticated diplomats in European history, essentially administered the Austrian Empire in his name for the better part of a decade. The empire ran. Ferdinand signed documents and attended ceremonies, and reportedly, according to widely cited but source-uncertain accounts, once stated that he was the emperor and wanted dumplings, a quote that may be apocryphal but has survived precisely because it sounds exactly right. He ruled until 1848, when the revolutions sweeping Europe gave the Habsburg court a convenient reason to replace him with his nephew Franz Joseph I, and he abdicated on December 2 of that year. Then he retired to Prague and lived until 1875, reaching the age of 82 longer than almost any Habsburg of the preceding generation, which is either a medical miracle or a reminder that longevity and fitness for leadership are entirely different biological questions. Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric XIV of Sweden was, by most accounts, genuinely brilliant, educated, intellectually curious, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of real political instincts right up until the evening in May of 1567, when he ordered the imprisonment of the Sture family, one of Sweden's most powerful noble houses, and then personally participated in their killing in what can only be described as a psychotic episode of the First Order. Members of the Sture family were killed in Uppsala Castle. Eric, by contemporary accounts, was in a dissociated state during the violence and afterward wandered into the Swedish countryside dressed in peasant clothing, apparently believing himself to no longer be the king. When he returned to lucidity, he reportedly wept over what had happened and attempted to pay blood money to the surviving Sture family members, which did not go as well as he might have hoped. The Vasa dynasty, which Eric's father Gustav I had founded in 1523, carried a pattern of psychological instability across multiple members. Historians have used the term Vasa madness to describe the heritable psychiatric legacy that appeared in Eric in elements of his brother Johann III's behavior and in other members of the line. Eric's inbreeding coefficient was not extreme by Habsburg standards, but the concentrated expression of mental illness across the dynasty suggests heritable psychiatric vulnerability amplified by a narrow gene pool. He was deposed by his brother Johann in 1568, imprisoned, and died on the 26th of February 1577. Almost certainly poisoned analysis of his remains, conducted in the 20th century, found arsenic concentrations consistent with deliberate poisoning. The pea soup his guards reportedly served him in his final days has become one of history's more grimly specific details. The Aves Trastamara Iberian cluster. The inbreeding that ultimately produced Charles II of Spain didn't begin with the Habsburgs. It began a century and a half earlier, in the interlocking royal houses of Portugal and Castile, where the House of Aves and the House of Trastamara spent decades exchanging children in marriage until their bloodlines were nearly indistinguishable. Joanna of Portugal, born in 1439, married Henry IV of Castile in 1455, a union that required papal dispensation because of their blood relationship. Henry was her uncle or close relative by consanguinity, depending on which line of the genealogy you trace. The daughter produced by this marriage, known as La Beltraneja, became the center of a succession crisis so severe it escalated into the War of Castilian Succession from 1475 to 1479. With her legitimacy disputed on both political and implicitly biological grounds, Henry IV himself is described by chroniclers of the era as possibly impotent or infertile, with his ability to father children questioned publicly in a way that would have been unthinkable for a less compromised king. This generation, messy, contested, medically ambiguous, directly produced the circumstances under which Ferdinand and Isabella came to power, married in 1469 as themselves distant cousins, and then handed the entire accumulated genetic burden of two inbreeding Iberian dynasties to the Habsburg line when their daughter Joanna married Philip of Habsburg. The explosion Charles II, empty throne, continental war, took another 150 years to detonate, but the fuse was lit in 15th century Iberia, in a series of carefully negotiated royal marriages that everyone at the time considered good politics. Charles II of Spain, the reckoning. Coming back to Charles II is not repetition, it is the only honest way to end this. Because every person on this list, from Cleopatra's looping Ptolemaic pedigree to Tutankhamun's shattered bones to Ferdinand I sitting blankly on the Habsburg throne while Metternich ran his empire, was part of the same long, slow calculation that terminated, definitively, in a single human being born in Madrid on the 6th of November, 1661. The 2009 PLOS ONE study by Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero titled The Role of Inbreeding in the Extinction of a European Royal Dynasty is among the most precise scientific autopsies ever performed on a historical bloodline. It found that Charles II's specific diseases, combined pituitary hormone deficiency and distal renal tubular acidosis, were the direct result of recessive gene mutations expressing simultaneously because both copies of the relevant genes, inherited from both parents, were defective, a statistical near impossibility in a normally reproducing population, and a near certainty in his. His ancestor Joanna of Castile appears in his genealogy repeatedly, her genetic contribution looping back through the tree from multiple directions like a river that keeps finding the same valley. He could not properly walk. He could not properly speak. He could not produce an heir from two separate marriages. He was exorcised, by his own request, because the gap between what a king was supposed to be and what he actually was had become so vast that supernatural explanation felt more manageable than the biological one. When he died in 1700, his autopsy recorded by the royal physicians who examined him described a body of a 38-year-old man that read like something decades older. Organs diminished, systems failed, the architecture of a human life built on a foundation that had been structurally compromised from the first moment of his existence. He did not fail. He was failed by 200 years of dynastic decision-making that treated human beings as variables in a political equation and never once stopped to ask what the equation was actually solving for. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.